Hello and welcome to Audiovisual Cultures, the podcast which examines sound and image-based cultural production. I'm the host and creator, Paula Blair. This time I'm joined by Shail for a post-screening discussion of The Little Stranger, the latest film directed by Lenny Abrahamson and an adaptation of Sarah Waters' gothic historical fiction of the same title. Topics we touch on include the adaptation process and themes of abuse, entitlement and the supernatural. If you would like to be part of the conversation, I'll be back at the end with contact details and ways you can support the podcast and building up the website. For now, enjoy the discussion. Hello, and we're back at the Tyneside for another screening. And this time we're going to watch The Little Stranger. We're just having a quick drink before it starts.
I think we need to be applauded for having done the cinema equivalent of getting gym memberships and using them. We are friends of the Tyneside and we must have been twice as often as we previously went because of our friendship with the Tyneside. And why is this a slightly special film for you?
Probably several reasons. I'm a huge fan of Lenny Abrahamson, the director. He's probably quite well known for Room and What Richard Did. I've been a follower of his work for quite a while. And also, The Little Stranger is adapted from the novel of the same title by Sarah Waters, which I read just earlier this year. I was a bit late to the party on that one, as I am with most contemporary literature. And I thoroughly enjoyed it. It sparked a love of reading in me again that had disappeared from me for a while. But I just was enthralled. I could barely put this novel down. So I'm really looking forward to the film. I'm quite interested to see what Lenny has done with it. I'm saying Lenny because I've actually met him once or twice.
And he would call you the P-Meister.
He wouldn't remember who I am. He's a very nice guy though.
Now also, The Little Stranger, it was shortlisted for the Booker a few years back. And then a couple of years ago, it was made the Booker Foundation One Book Project book for a specific year.
Why
that
we
means
both
that
have a copy.
Yeah, that's why we've got copies. And now, of course, I still haven't read it. What that involves is every single student at Newcastle University gets a free copy of the book. And then there's a huge, let's have a great big discussion thing, a big evening where the writer comes and does a big in-conversation thing on stage. I have every reason to have read this book and still haven't. Now,
other than you're an academic and you're very busy and who has time to read novels for pleasure when you're doing these things?
I'm in the middle of reading a novel for pleasure right now, actually, just not this one. But anyway, thank you very much for pointing out that this was at the Tyneside this interesting weekend.
Well, the thing is, when I read the book and I finished it, I got so into it that I wanted to write something and I wrote a blog post about it. So I gushed out about 2,000 words of an essay on it. And when I was looking into it a little bit and looking into Sarah Waters for that, I saw that the film was in post-production at the time.
Right.
So I've been looking out for this film for months.
Also, we're at the Tyneside, which likes to do screenings of films that are adaptations as part of its book club, which you and I have both done in the past.
Well, we've attended.
And I used to run it, and I've been the guest speaker at a few. This would have been an absolute ideal one for you to do if only I had remembered when it came out.
Pass it on.
Oh, actually, hang on.
Months ago.
Yeah, I did.
But nobody ever.
I did pass it on.
To me.
The organisers may have let it lapse. Happens. It's done completely voluntarily. Who knows? Yes, actually, I'm going to give myself a lot more credit there than I was about to.
No,
I passed it on.
But it was months ago. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. No, I've just been looking forward to seeing it, and I am curious about. I think normally I would be quite worried, but then it's hard to know what any filmmaker is going to do. But Lenny Abrahamson, for me, is somebody who's built up a lot of trust. I feel like I get a quality product with him every time.
Right.
So I feel more anxious that there will come a time when that won't happen. I think back to films like Frank and What Richard Did. These are films I've seen once, and they have always stayed with me.
Right.
Room has always stayed with me. Adam and Paul has always stayed with me. I just feel like, well, if anybody's going to make this, it's him.
Yeah.
But I am quite interested as well because it's a novel in which, so it's a woman writer, and Sarah Waters is probably best known for Tipping the Velvet. She does a lot of historical fiction, and I have discovered in myself that I'm really into historical fiction. Really into it now.
It's such a juicy genre.
Yeah, I have been for a long time, but it didn't really dawn on me that was something I was really into until probably this year.
What's the appeal? Can you put your finger extra on what the extra dash of
imagining
sauce
the real
is?
actual past. I don't know what it is, and something that could happen, that could have happened, that could have played out.
I think what might be going on there is when an author goes, I've done a piece of historical fiction, what they're implicitly saying is, I've also done some historical research.
Yes, exactly.
And,
it's embedded in something that there's terminology in the book that you would need to have researched. You can't just know these things because those words don't really exist for things in our world anymore.
When an author has done some historical research, even if it's secondhand, they've read some histories of the period. That says to me, I, the author, am willing to go the extra mile on this project, and that counts as a guarantee of quality. Even if it's a guarantee of it being a rampage around a certain historical period rather than a guarantee of it being a really tight narrative, fine.
When you've got really precise details of parts of buildings, The Little Stranger is largely set around an old big house. If you like, in the UK, it's 100 tall. It's a huge mansion house in the countryside that has been owned by the Irish family for 200 years. It has historical resonance in the very fabric of the building, and just the really specific terminology, words I had to look up the meaning of because we don't use them anymore for just describing minute parts of the building, the intricate detail of that and the working of such a house and the hierarchy of the staff that ran it, as well as the family, the bloodlines. There's that, and then the geography of the place that it's in, all the connecting villages and the proximity to London, the costume. It comes so vividly to life in your imagination, and to get that much detail and to tell a rip-roaring story that grips you and you don't want to stop reading it, that is something really special. Actually, I started reading that novel, and by the end of the first page I was just thinking, I wish I could write like this. This is incredible.
I'm willing to lay a little money down that you could, with a bit of concentration. Judging from the trailer, we're going to have a tense next couple of hours.
It is a really tense story because it was one of those things where I need to keep reading because I need to see what happens next, but I also need a break from this guy, because this is what I was going to say is I'm interested to see how it's been done because it's a male director, but then also Lenny Abrahamson is Irish, and this is a very English story. It's set in 1948, so it's just post-war, and the main character that you follow, and he is the narrator of the book, and he's telling the story retrospectively as if it's an account for himself to try and work out what happened. He still doesn't understand what really happened to him, so he's telling it from his past. He is being revealed to you in the words that he is writing. I thought he's a thoroughly despicable character, but he's got all the reasoning of a semi-privileged white man who is a medical doctor would in the mid-20th century.
Yeah.
Through his own eyes and the eyes of just about everybody else, he is not doing anything wrong, but from 21st century eyes, he's doing everything wrong. I'm really quite interested in how that's going to be dealt with, because I think it's a real examination of toxic masculinity, but the worst kind. It's kind of toxic masculinity that is completely normal and fine in society, but society doesn't bat an eyelid, doesn't realise that it is in fact toxic.
Now, he's played by Domhnall Gleeson.
Domhnall Gleeson, yes. I know it's spelled Domhnall, but it's say it fast as Domhnall.
Domhnall. Okay, only two silent consonants in that particular Irish name?
Yes.
Domhnall.
Yes.
He's basically only ever played completely heroic characters, as I've...
I don't know though.
Oh no, there was the guy in Force Awakens. Yeah, he was a caricaturish Nazi in that one. Okay, I'll take it back.
Again, it's interesting, another Irish actor who is making a career at playing very English or English-sounding characters as well. With the book, it's not a woman's point of view, it's the man's point of view, but written by a woman.
Right.
It's a real examination, but then I'm wondering if there's going to be Englishness examined by Irish point of view, or an Irish. There's something very interesting going on there, but we'll see when we see the film. I'm just speculating at the moment. The character of Caroline is wonderful. I feel so sorry for her throughout so much. She's a really incredible, well-rounded character. She's got strength in that she holds so much together throughout the whole thing, but also You can almost see what's coming for her, but it's still a shock when it comes. It's one of those things where I know it's building up to something, but how it happens is... So I don't know if they'll have made any changes, how faithful it's going to be. I really hope that the film captures how fleshed out she is, how rounded she is, how complex she is. She's fascinating in the book because I find that she's quite asexual, but nobody's really allowing her to be that.
There's difficult stuff to do audiovisually. Not impossible, of course.
Yeah, but also it's never explicitly said. And again, every vision of any of the characters is through Dr. Faraday.
Right.
You only get what he thinks of everybody.
So we're automatically going to get a switch from first-person narration to relatively focalised third-person narration.
From the trailer, though, it does seem as if there is a voiceover that's subjective to Faraday.
Well, I would like to make a prediction that the existence of character narrators in films, which usually manifest through the whole thing being a dramatisation of some sort of later memoir that they're speaking or dictating or just speaking as they're writing, that usually involves having a bit of spoken narration at the beginning and a bit of spoken narration at the end, but having nothing in between. Maybe one or two little moments of pause in between, but not having wall-to-wall spoken narration, because that's generally seen to be inappropriate for filmic narration. For that to coexist with the film's own narrative process, the way that this sort of edit, this sort of move stipulates this, calls attention to that, points out that this character is mistaken, all that stuff. To have these two levels of narration going on at once generally seems to be seen to be inappropriate. So that's my prediction. I'm willing to be shown to be wrong. Of course, Lenny Abrahamson may be the one to do this.
From the part that is in the trailer, it's very similar to the first pages of the novel, actually. It begins with the earliest memories he has of being at Hundreds Hall as a child because his mother worked there.
Yeah.
He's working class, made good. The story in the book is that his parents have really wrecked themselves, probably actually damaged their health. They both died fairly young, both worked themselves to the bone to pay for his education.
Right,
And he becomes a medical doctor, so he's quite middle class. He's not rich, but he's not that poor either. Still, the Irish family, although a lot of their money's gone, they still are of a class that is beyond him. But I think he really wants to wheedle his way in there. And I don't think he consciously realises how much he desires their status in life.
If only doing historical fiction about England in the first half of the 20th century could somehow escape anxieties about a disintegrating class system. It has to be a story about that. If it's first half of the 20th century.
It's interesting for him as well because it's 1948 where most of the story is told. That's still retrospective, but you don't know when he's writing from.
Yeah.
Possibly the 1960s, but it's really hard to tell. Maybe there are clues in there and I've forgotten, but most of the story that you're reading is 1948 and he's a medical doctor, so he's actually quite concerned about the prospect of the NHS coming in.
Timely.
The film is quite timely in terms of discussions around the privatisation of the NHS, so how much of that is going to be in the film we'll see, but that would be very interesting to play on that too.
I'm expecting many great things.
This book was published, was it 96 or something like that? Either 2006, and since reading it I've read lots of mid-90s books.
Yeah.
So it's not that recent. A lot of times with novels it'll come out and then within a couple of years you'll have the adaptation.
I'd love to do a study of which books get adapted about 20 years later as opposed to within a few years, so they ride the crest of the original publicity
Because I
wave.
think Tipping the Velvet was very quickly picked up as the television series.
I didn't know about when The Little Stranger was first published, and this is a surprise because I expected, it must be her most recent book because why would they adapt something old?
I remember when Tipping the Velvet came out on television, I think that really blew a lot of people's minds.
Yeah.
You know, and again it was historical fiction but about lesbians.
Well, it's movie night, and for a discussion between somebody whose attention will be drawn to differences between source text and film, and someone whose attention will be entirely on shot duration, our listeners are going to have to wait no time at all, or as well have to wait about 2 hours. Sarah Waters' The Little Stranger was originally published in 2009.
And it does feel very contemporary, I think.
certainly when I read it, there's so many issues in it that are really prescient. Now, probably even more so thinking back to 2009, I think we're talking more openly about issues around toxic masculinity, entitlement, certainly male entitlement over possession, and women included in the idea of desired possessions, but also things like homes and status and things as well. Even what would have been called behaviour in a woman leading a man on is more likely to be called for what it is now, attempted rape and that sort of thing that emerges. So I think now, after having seen the film and we're back home and in a quiet and thinking about it, because I have some questions for myself, I wonder if I'd have enjoyed the film more if I had not read the book. I also wonder if an adaptation could have benefited from a serial, perhaps, because the film is about as faithful as a film adaptation of quite a chunky novel can be.
Right.
But of course that means they've had to shed quite a lot of things. And of course visually and through sound it's very economic. There are a lot of things that are shown rather than what would have been explained at length in the novel. On the converse of that, you've got quite a lot of things being said that weren't said in the novel that you had to read between the lines to understand. So I felt like it was very blatant, and the book is a lot more ambiguous because you're coming at it from his point of view, whereas the film, I think, as you suspected, and as film can often do, it comes out of that a little bit and shows you what you imagine might be happening, whereas in the novel it's completely subjective to Faraday. So even the descriptions of people you can't trust. The film does things in a nice way, and I suppose in a darkly funny way. Things like Faraday's developing relationship with Caroline very early on, and it takes quite a lot of the book to get to the point where he's invited to the dinner party.
Whereas that seems to happen quite quickly.
It happens quite quickly in the film. He ingratiates himself and they develop his friendship, so that happens very fast. There's a massive build up to that in the book. Caroline's presented as somebody, she doesn't really, she doesn't wear makeup, she wears quite ill-fitting clothes, she's not skinny, she has a lot of labour to do keeping this house running. Mostly she's doing quite a lot of the physical labour of that, so she perhaps looks a bit slovenly, but she's not slovenly, she's practical for what she has to do. So she's not paying attention to her hair, to makeup. In the text, in the novel, there's a lot of his descriptions of her, or of her unshaven legs. Quite a lot of the first part of it takes place in a really hot summer, and a lot of their encounters are during that time. That's very, very compressed in the film.
Right.
His descriptions of her, actually he's quite repulsed by Caroline, but yet is talking himself into latching onto her emotionally. And in the film, the only hint that he, at this party when she's dressed up and she's wearing a little bit of makeup, he says, "You look very beautiful, Caroline," and then there's a shot of her slouching back with the dog lying across the sofa with her and a cigarette hanging out of her mouth. She's about to light it and she's just looking at him in a deadpan way.
It's a fantastic shot.
It's a great shot, and that's all the reply you need is he's just saying that.
I think it's also a great example of narration in cinema, because that's not narration at the level of there's a character doing narrating. No. It's the narrating agency of not the filmmakers, not the director, not the producers, not a specific person, but the narrating agency of the filmic process itself. Because what we had there was a character looking into off-screen space saying, "You look very beautiful," cut to an eyeline match showing what he's looking at, and it's ironically contrasting with what he just said, because while Ruth Wilson
is excessively lovely.
Yeah, she's statuesque. In that particular shot, everything about the way she's both dressed and positioned is completely counters what he's just said. So there was a slight titter at that moment in our 15-strong audience at the Tyneside.
She's wearing a very nice dress, but it's ill-fitting, and she's not comfortable in it. And Ruth Wilson has played the character of Caroline so well. She clumps about with open legs. She wears big heavy boots. She's a hard worker and she's very intelligent, and she has had no need for any fripperies. She's a complete contrast to her mother, who still presents herself very well. Her clothes are very fine, but they're aging as she is. She's very fine but aging. And in the novel Faraday, he's more attracted to the mother actually, and he's somewhere between their ages.
Right.
I think it's not clear with Donald Gleeson because he looks quite young still, but Faraday is a good, I think the character of Caroline is about 27 in the novel, and he's maybe around 40. Then the mother is, I think, 60 or something like that.
We could do a quick bit of maths. Ruth Wilson was born early 1982.
She's older than me, but she's playing a character who's... Well, that makes sense actually, because people aged more and her life is hard. So Caroline doesn't look young, but 1948, 27 looks old to us now.
And Donald Gleeson was born in 1983, so he's actually about
younger than her.
13 months younger than her.
And then you've got somebody very elegant like Charlotte Rampling, who has quite a lot of heft behind her, but still, I don't know if it's a generational thing or what, but Donald Gleeson is perhaps the better known name. Because Charlotte Rampling's done quite a lot of more obscure or more niche films.
Well, we were asking ourselves why it is that the name Sarah Waters doesn't appear prominently in the trailers for this film. You pointed out that it's because Donald Gleeson is probably the most bankable name here. Even Lenny Abrahamson is just the director of The Room in the...
Room, not the
Sorry,
Room.
Sorry. It's the director of Room.
It's a very important distinction
Sorry.
that we've discussed before many episodes
Let
ago.
us never mention the existence of a film similar to Room in its title. On a scale of 0 to 100, so stated as a percentage, how faithful an adaptation was this?
Over 80%.
But like you say, new dialogue stuffed in there.
Not just new dialogue, but even just new images are in there, particularly the very end. At the end of the film, you're left with no doubt as to what or who the poltergeist belongs to.
Wow.
But in the book, he has no clue what he's brought to this place. And there is still a question mark of, did everybody just go mad, or was it something else? Quite early on in the film, it's very clear that it's attached to him. But then I don't know if that's me recognising the signs, because how they even dealt with him as a little boy being at in the photograph, that's not in the book. There's a photograph of the staff and his mother's in that, and he's not sure which person exactly is his mother, but that's what he sees when he sees the photographs in the home. There's nothing about him being in a photograph. And actually his resentment of Susan, who's the daughter of the heirs who died before Caroline and Roderick were born, so they've got this sister that they can't even... There's actually a bit of Caroline not being able to think of Susan as her sister because she died before she was alive. There's some really fascinating concepts around that, but Faraday's resentment towards Susan, it's not really clear, and it's not really resentment, it's not necessarily jealousy, it's so subtle in the book. That's why I was thinking a serial might have been better, because it needs to be drawn out. He's one of these upstanding members of the community that behind doors is an abuser. The book does that to the reader. I think it draws you in. He's so lovely, he's so mild-mannered, he's such a good doctor, he has such good manner about him. He's not even aware of his own powers of manipulation. He's actually very innocent. He doesn't realise he's got this darkness in him. That's actually the worst kind of abuser, is the abuser who on the surface and to themselves is a good person. He's a good friend, he's good to everybody. He doesn't realise what he's doing. Also then the reader doesn't quite realise, because when things start you're thinking back and you're going, well, all this started when Betty arrived at the house. So for quite a while you in the book, at least I did, these strange goings on are attached to her perhaps. And then the thing with the letters starts, because that happens again quite fast in the film. It ramps up really quickly with the letters. That's actually a really slow burn in the book, where they discover them in the drawing room, and then it's quite a while later, it's months later, they start appearing elsewhere in the house. Is it Betty? Is it Mrs. Ayres? Is it Caroline? Is it Faraday? So is it Roderick? Because actually it looks like it's Roderick for a long time too. There's quite a slow build up to the fire in his room. It chips away at you, like that kind of relationship can chip away at you. You're in too deep before you realise something's not right here. Every time Caroline gives consent to something, he's managed to get that out of her. It's enforced giving of consent.
Yeah, consent through, okay, if I say yes to this now, you'll stop bugging me. Or as kids put it, I'll just keep asking you until you say yes.
Yeah, you owe this to me, I've done so much for you.
This characteristic of it could be 5 different people, and whatever it is that they're doing, it might be supernatural, and the supernatural is completely a thing in this story space, or it might be them trying to do something to the others through natural means. Either they're mentally ill or they have some sort of plan to kill the rest of the family. That it could be these 5 people. It's a characteristic of detective fiction, of course, but this is detective fiction mixed with what very soon starts to become apparent is the supernatural, which is, I think, a mixture I'm not familiar with. It probably has pre-existed this. Usually the way that the supernatural and detective fiction tend to interact is that the obvious assumption that people make in a detective fiction scenario is there's this non-explained phenomenon. Characters in the story space assume that the explanation is supernatural, and then the detective comes in and shows that it's not. That's usually the relationship between the two. So this was a fresh way in which the two could be brought together.
There was, when I was reading the book, a while where I was thinking, is it the ghost of Susan that's doing these things? And it was only when Mrs. Ayres began believing that I thought, that's not right either. I think the idea of the detective, it was interesting in the film where Faraday bumps into Celie, again, who's a doctor who's of higher class than him. There's a lot more in the book between them two. Rather than going to the pub, Celie brings him round to his house. And again there, he sees this much bigger house, this big family. He's not invited to stay for dinner. But Celie is the one who... It's like this in the film where he says there were these strange goings on in my experience before, and I've read about this, and actually that was where the research from Sarah Waters came in. It was actual books on phantasmagoria. They never actually used the word poltergeist in the novel.
Right.
I think they refer to it as phantasms and it being psychological. He brings that idea up, and Caroline finds books that belonged to her father on that area and independently starts to read these things and starts to think about them. And it's Faraday, because in the film he entertains the notion because he's trying to grasp at an explanation, but in the book he's absolutely hard-nosed scientist about it. He's, I will only believe this if I have demonstrable evidence that I can see and feel and hear and whatever. Yeah. He explains away everything as irrational and that everybody has mental health issues because of the war and stuff like that, or because of the state of the house and what's become of the family. He writes everything off. He doesn't entertain that anything supernatural could be happening, and so there's this constant denial of what he is. So very much again like the abuser narrative and issue, they often can't see what they are.
It would have worked completely fine if it had just turned out that there was nothing supernatural going on at all, that it was just a psychological thriller to do with the disintegration of the aristocracy.
And you can read the book like that. You see, it's open enough that it gives you that kernel of doubt. It's just, there's the moment where it's, I was going to say absolutely clear, but even then you can doubt it. But when it's at its clearest and most indicative that it's a poltergeist and it's coming from him, is the run up to Caroline's death. And I was really quite dreading this in the film. I think that was part of it as well. I think I couldn't really relax in the film because I knew what was coming, and there were lots of laborious shots of the staircase from below. He's at a point in the film where he hasn't been upstairs yet until he needs to start caring for Mrs. Ayres, but there's lots of shots of him looking up the staircase, and I knew what was coming that whole time. The way it's written is incredible, but it's gut-wrenching, really upsetting. They played it probably as similarly as they could in audiovisual language. He pulls into the little clearing that he'd pulled into when he'd had an incident with Caroline in the January of that year when they went to the doctor's dance. And afterwards, she's been on her own. Her own life has had to be put on hold because her brother was injured very badly in the Second World War, and she'd been with the Wrens and had had this really full and exciting life with them during the war, but then had to stop all that and return home and care for her brother, because her brother, as the male, he's the youngest, but he's the only male heir, so everything falls to him to look after the home and the business, because it's not really that clear in the film, but they run a little farm as well. She's had this night out. Faraday's been, looking over at her. He's been watching her. She bumps into somebody that she knows and dances, and he doesn't really see her much for this, and he's seething in resentment at this because he's brought her out and he's had no attention from her. She's been dancing with all these other people and having a great time, and this is somebody who has got no life anymore and has the very hard work of keeping this massive house running. And by this point her brother's been put in an asylum by Faraday because he was starting to become affected by the things going on in the house, and his room spontaneously went on fire. But of course it's made to look like he probably did it himself. In the book he's asleep the whole time, he's knocked out, he's drunk when the room goes on fire. So they've done that differently in the film where he's been awake.
So in the film, there's, they're adding in elements in the film, even though the film's really clear that at the end that there's a supernatural element to this. They're adding in other elements early on to sow more doubt in the book. So we're at the point at the end of the night out, which has been great, when Faraday and Caroline pull over in Faraday's little car and have a little bit of snogging.
The build up to that I think is really important. The context of what this character's life has been and what that night has been to her. She's had this burst of freedom suddenly and she's been enjoying herself. She's been allowed to let loose. It's 2 a.m. He's driving her home. It's very icy. It's cold. She's cold. She's trying to get her legs warmed up. She's being a little bit coquettish with him. It's very similar. I mean, some of the dialogue was, from what I can remember, very similar to the book as well. It's almost word for word.
Yeah.
She says to him, I don't want to go home yet. I'm not ready to go home. I don't want to go back to that place. You get the sense that it's not that she wants to be with him.
Yeah.
She just doesn't want to go back there. She just doesn't want to stop having fun. She's not ready to go back to hard labour. She wants a bit more fun. It's quite aggressive in the book. It comes across, I think, quite well in the film too, where he reads between the lines and quite roughly starts going at her, basically starts roughly kissing her and grabbing at her clothes and things. He's quite forceful, and then she very suddenly pushes him off, says no, and of course in the book it's more drawn out. She's very upset and she's apologetic, and he's very angry with her. He really has a go at her. Some of the dialogue's the same, where he says, I thought you wanted it, and she said, I thought I did. Reading between the lines, what she wants is just fun.
Yeah.
Not necessarily with him, and not necessarily that with him. Because it's told from his point of view, it's hard to know what her sexuality might be, if she even has sexuality. It's possible she's gay or bisexual or asexual. It's hard to know. I think the bottom line is she doesn't have the hots for him, and he tries to force her into having those feelings for him.
There's one potentially redeeming moment, which is when he says, the morning after that, she says, can we just start again? And I thought, all right, he seems to be conscientious enough to go, I did something wrong. I think the only way to fix it is just to say, can we just ignore the absolute car crash that was the last couple of weeks and just start again? But then on the same day, he's manipulating her into agreeing to marry him.
Yeah.
You were partly through explaining why it's clear in the last scene, the scene where Caroline dies, why it's clear that it's supernatural and caused by Faraday.
He has a night call, something really bad with some of the underclass patients that he has.
Yeah.
He does drive back through one of the paths that they've let him have access to that go through the estate. He stops in the same place, the same little clearing that incident had happened in before with Caroline. In the book, he describes it as him being really upset, him sitting having a cigarette, and then he wakes up the next morning after having really feverish dreams, and he describes the dream I found it really vivid. You could almost see it happening. In the dream, he imagines driving up to hundreds, driving right up to the front door, bursting in through the front door, running up the stairs, and it cuts off there. In the novel, then describing going back home when he wakes up in the morning and his colleague is there. He explains everything about what's happened, and Caroline has had this horrendous fall from the top floor of the house down through the whole stairwell, and that has of course killed her, broken her neck and back and killed her instantly. Very similar in that you have the inquest and him describing what Betty says, very much as it is in the film, and what we see is what's happened with Caroline is that she's heard something upstairs in the nursery rooms, and so she's gone up to look and she's reacted to something. She turns and she says, it's you. And then moments later she falls.
Although there was some degree of clarity in the film about what was causing all of these, well, I suppose there's a whole range of things, from the dog attacking the little girl, through to the fire in Rod's room, through to Caroline being pushed by something off that top floor of the stairwell. Yeah, it's clear that that's being caused by something supernatural, but I found myself still thinking at the end, in that very last shot, we've seen what it is on this particular occasion, and it's the child version of Faraday, but that still leaves loads of unanswered questions. So does this mean that whenever Faraday gets angry, he splits off a part of his psyche, and that goes off and does things in the form of some supernatural being, and that always manifests as his child self? Or is it that back when he was a child, he split this part of his psyche off, and then since then it's been living in the house?
Nice, yeah.
And then now that he's come back to it well over 20 years later, it's nearly 30 years later, isn't it? Since he's come back to it, then he's able to influence what it does. Or is it that the thing that manifests itself around the house is some sort of non-material, non-visible, wafty force that Faraday sends out there each time that he gets angry, and that the little boy we see, the little boy version of Faraday we see at the end, isn't anyone who's been making any sort of difference? That's just a projection of him, of his thoughts near the end. Well, I suppose the only real evidence we have is that Caroline says you, and if Caroline said you to an adult Faraday, or some sort of ghostly version of an adult Faraday, that would make a lot of sense. If she said it to the boy version of Faraday, that wouldn't make much sense, because she doesn't really know what he looked like. She's not seen him in the photo, she's seen his shoulder in the photo, and I suppose he'd have the same hair colour as Donald Gleeson does, so he'd have quite ginger hair, but I don't think she'd say you. I think what we're supposed to think there is that an adult version of Faraday has manifested in the house somehow, and that's what's been happening throughout, and that belays he split off a part of himself when he was a kid, and that's been living in the house ever since thing. But if that's not happening, then why is it that Rod thinks that there's this thing living in the house, and he's been thinking it for quite some time, well before Faraday turns up initially? He keeps saying, I'm not strong enough to face it
anymore, yes.
That implies that the house is haunted by something.
Yes, it's been there for a long time. I think that's what, in the novel, that's why I think you're easily led to believe that it's the ghost of Susan, something along those lines, because it couldn't possibly have been Faraday, because there's this 30-year absence of him. So yes, it points towards part of him being left in the house. It's almost like an exchange happens when he snaps the acorn, the plaster acorn off part of the house.
It's a picture frame, a mirror frame.
Because I think it's actually part of, in the novel, it's part of something on the wall. It's more integral to the house than it's carved in wood, something like that. And also in the book, his mother's still in the employ, whereas in the film, it seems like his mother doesn't work there anymore. She used to.
That's weird, that.
Yeah.
It seems like a pointless change.
Because his mother was actually the nursemaid to Susan.
Right.
And that, for me, was part of his resentment, because he didn't desire Mrs. Ayres as his mother. His mother was spending most of her time raising this other child, and not him. So when I was reading the novel, I felt that that was part of his resentment, is that this other family got everything of his, And then his parents later on, he barely sees them because they're working themselves to the bone, and they both die very young. His mother, I can't remember all the details now, but I think in my blog post I wrote about this, where again, reading between the lines, it's possible that his same poster guy has caused his own mother's death as well. There's a lot more on those things too.
I did like that at one point. I mean, films kind of have to do this. At one point, Faraday talking to, who's the older doctor in the pub?
Seeley.
Faraday talking to Seeley says, I know this sounds like nonsense, but how about this for a theory? We know that our consciousness is partite and that we can have entire other personalities in there. How about the idea that one of those personalities could split off and somehow attain influence over the world outside of our bodies? Now, it just sounds really silly, doesn't it? But of course, that's the film saying, just to be clear, this is what's happening. I had one of the characters describing exactly the sort of supernatural thing you now need to be looking for. We've been given quite a few clues about that so far, in that any time that one of these supernatural things was happening, we'd get a shot of Faraday's face in extremely shallow focus, as if to say, something weird's going on now where he's being separated from the world around him. And we'd also get audio which was a rumbling, intense rumbling sound, and at some points I went, is that the intense rumbling sound of the film, or is it the metro? It goes directly over the downside. Alright, yeah, so we're told about this. It was useful because we've got this whole other roster of supernatural stuff people have made up over the years, and Ghost is one of them. People being so traumatised that they lash out with their minds, so maybe Rod set the fire by just being traumatised. That's another version of supernatural stuff that we've made up over the years. Spirit memories in objects, that's another one. Conan Doyle was actually quite into the idea that objects can have spirit memory, if they had been around when something intense happened. I was just having a quick look on the old Wikipedia to see if anyone had noted down where the Ludgate Town Centre scenes were shot, because it seemed like one of those living history museums. This is Wikipedia, so may be completely wrong, but its reference for this is the 6th of July 2017 issue of Screen Daily. Different principal photography, and it was, as the credits stated, it was a UK-Ireland co-production. Principal photography, mid-2017, in different locations outside London, including Winslow in Buckinghamshire and Yorkshire. So, Living History Museum somewhere in Yorkshire, I'm thinking, for that. And they'd only filmed two sides of the square when they were doing it, as a rule. So we will not be sleeping tonight, of course, because that was quite scary.
It was creepy. There were times when I had a bit of trouble sleeping when I was reading the book. Some of the images even that the book gave me have really stayed with me. I don't think they'll be replaced by the film too much. There were some really lovely visual touches. I suppose literally, really, the tactility of the house really comes alive. Just little touches, like he's finally going up the stairs and he's caressing the banister, because it's the first time he's going up there, so it's quite a big thing for him. He's been coveting the upstairs of this house for a long time, and things like watching Caroline pinning the wallpaper back down where it's starting. It
seems to be that cloth wallpaper that you get in posh houses. The here's a house and it's falling to bits element of this film, which was a huge cornerstone. It was done amazingly. Particularly as they had to also do a few scenes in the same house looking completely pristine for back in the 1919 flashback bits. I can't help but think that it was two different houses. There's been times when I've been to National Trust or English Heritage Properties and they've preserved a house in the simplest way, where they've made sure that the roof doesn't leak and there's no smashed windows, but that's it. So they're not going to maintain anything on the interior. The rooms are going to remain empty. Those feel very eerie next to your average National Trust property, which is maintained as if it's still lived in. People tend to find that most comforting. Something about empty houses, which is a little bit disconcerting anyway, and an empty big house like that. The film is doing a great job of going, hey look how occupied it is and how full it is and how warm it is back in the 1919 flashback sequences. But look now how there's leaks in the roof, birds in the house. Some rooms they've just given up on. Some rooms are empty. You can see leaves blowing through some of the rooms. I was just waiting for the scene where the whole place would just get burnt down by somebody having an episode of some kind. But no, didn't get that. As far as the aristocracy is over now narrative was concerned, it was merciless. Just having that one line where Rod said 75% death duties. I don't think this Labour government will be happy until we're all begging on street corners. Death duties were that high shortly after the Second World War. That is why so many stately homes are in the hands of the National Trust, because suddenly it just became impractical to to occupy them.
It goes into that quite a bit in the novel, actually, as they start to list family friends of other big houses that have had to shut down completely and sell off, and selling the lands off to new housing estates, as you see in the film at the end. Is that there's a little epilogue where Faraday, a couple of years later, on one of those visits, because the house is basically his. After he gets what he wants, not in the way he wants it, but he gets what he wants, the house is entirely his after it all goes, because it's just left derelict and anybody can go in.
Right. Yes.
And then you see the grounds where they've been sold off and the housing estate has been built. He walks through it and bumps into Betty. She's living there she's getting one with her husband-to-be. She's only about 17 or 16 at that point. And this is a couple of years after the events that he describes in about 1950. There's quite a lot more about the carving up of the land and property to working class people who are doing better. And she does go and get a factory job, and she starts a new life.
Betty is a fantastic crap servant. It's crap servants of the Acorn Antiques quality. Do you remember that? There was the cafe next door to Acorn Antiques, and the servant in that was... Who was it played by?
Was it Julie Walters?
That was it, yeah. And she was playing somebody who was like 50 years older than her, who was crap. That's part of the whole disintegration of the aristocracy narrative, is that they get to a point where they can afford one servant and it's a crap servant who's really young.
I mean, I think Betty tries really hard. Certainly in the novel you see her improving quite a bit, and she gets very loyal. She actually develops a very close relationship with Mrs. Ayres.
Yeah.
And she gets better, but she is very young. She's 13, 14 when she starts working in the house, and naive, but has this intuitiveness. She can feel the presence in the house immediately, and there's a lot more of her trying to convince people, but they all just think she's this stupid little girl. There's almost this battle of wits between what she can perceive and what Faraday is projecting.
Right.
She really perceives it very strongly. It doesn't seem to affect her directly. The first time is when it makes her feel ill, but it doesn't affect her directly again after that. She's quite strong.
There was one point where I was thinking, ooh, whatever this thing is clearly something supernatural, and it's able to do quite horrible things to Mrs. Ayres, because there's that moment when suddenly blood's appearing on her top.
It's quite scary,
and the ghost, the supernatural force, is pricking her skin live, and she keeps going, ooh, and these blood spots appear on her shirt as she's clearly being wounded underneath. I found myself going, right, so we've established so far that there's something supernatural in this house. And we've also established that Faraday seems to have this ability that he can't quite control to split part of himself off and go and do supernatural things. Are these two forces going to be going head to head? Is this going to be interesting? How there's going to be the supernatural force symbolising the aristocracy and the supernatural force symbolising the upstart working class boy. I thought that might be quite cute for a bit. But of course, they're just the same thing, aren't they? It's all coming from him.
Yes.
So that meant that he was unconsciously pricking her with his mind underneath her clothes.
Yeah.
Switching throughout.
It's notable, if you think about what they're talking about at any time, selling the land off, you can't do that. You have to save the house, or it's Caroline getting away from it. No, she has to stay here. She belongs here. There's stuff about when Mrs. Ayres, it comes through in the novel that she doesn't really have... I'm trying to think of the best way to put this, because when I say she doesn't have much regard for him, that implies, she doesn't like him. That's not what I mean. He just comes and goes as far as she's concerned. She doesn't feel anything for him. But in the film, they ram this point home that she's saying, you don't belong here.
Right.
At no point does she ever say that. It's all implicit. It's her not welcoming him in the way he wants her to.
Yeah.
He feels that from her. She never actually says it. She doesn't even pay it any mind. She doesn't even think about it.
Well, this is part of Sarah Waters' fictionalised account of what happened to the landowning families of England. And it seems that what she's doing is she's saying, poor things, they were victimised out of what was, a class-based hierarchy, which they were at the top. So they're victimised out of this position of privilege, and horrible things were done to them in the process. Almost like it's an attempt to try to salvage some reputation for that hierarchical system. And the 1919 flashback period, it's strange that it's post First World War. Because usually if you're looking back to a golden era, it's before the First World War. You know, it's that Edwardian long hot summer of everything was fine, imperial glory and all that. But having the flashback to Empire Day 1919, that seems to be a reference to just a later version of people still having the same conceptions about England's place in the world. The people are conceited, and Suki, the young girl who seems to have died very soon afterwards, she's mean to young Faraday.
And that's not in the book at all. They
Okay.
never meet.
And the house is out of bounds, and there's a big white ribbon across the way you might enter the house to say poor people don't come into the house, they're only invited to the garden. So there are these elements of, oh, these aristocrats are a bit mean, aren't they? But then having them taken down in such a brutal way is a way of just mildly protesting the fact that they lost this status.
But also the book goes into the pressure they're under to maintain so much of it and
Right.
maintain dignity while everything's falling down around them. It's hugely hard work what they're having to do, and especially after the father has died, and that happens some point between the very first time Faraday goes to the house as a child and when he goes back as an adult. It's at some point between, and Roderick has to manage the house even though he's very badly injured in the war. He's been in the RAF and his plane was shot down, and he is, I think in the book it says something like of his squadron he's the only survivor, so he's got survivor's guilt on top of the injuries and the mental health issues that he develops. So it goes into quite a lot of detail. Actually in the book as well there's quite a few visits to him in the asylum. The breakdown, it's at once it's that embracing of change. There's constant worry as well about the idea of the NHS beginning, and of course it begins in 1949. In the book when Faraday talks from his present, whenever that is, he describes it, well actually everything turned out fine. We've got really nice practice.
On the NHS, could this story be about how, metaphorically, if you rely on private practice, there's no system of oversight that ensures that doctors act ethically? And without the system of oversight, look what some very small percentage of doctors will do to their patients. And that's become these little moral arbiters of situations who decide who lives and decide who dies. In that sense, his poltergeist, his ability to do things supernaturally, could be an allusion to doctors having an inappropriate, as far as the filmmakers are concerned here, and of course as far as it seems maybe Sarah Waters is concerned, insufficient oversight and therefore too much power over life and death. Maybe what the film is saying right at this point where we're celebrating the 70th birthday, and one of its virtues is accountability. If they are NHS doctors, they're part of the thing which ensures that they're responsible to their fellow humans rather than tiny gods, which is a reason to keep it. One of many reasons to keep it.
There is the part of the film, of the story, where Faraday is using Roderick as a bit of a guinea pig for treatment that he's trialling,
Yeah.
because he's lost a lot of mobility in his legs. Faraday's using this
It's an
electrical,
An induction coil.
he's using this to try and get sensation and movement back in the legs.
And it works.
And it starts to work, and Roderick starts to improve. But then the force in the house gets stronger, and Roderick can't fight it, and he's trying to fight it, and it seems like he's been carrying that for years.
Big shout out to Will Poulter.
Yeah.
Poulter? Who is 10 years younger again than both
Mhm.
Ruth Wilson and Donald Gleeson, born in January 1993, who played Roderick.
He's probably one of the only people playing the same age as the character almost, because Roderick is quite young. I think he's only about 24 or something, the character.
And so he's 25. Well, he would have been 24 when filming took place. He did a great job of looking
Yeah.
older because of having been through so much.
Yes.
Now, voices. I just wanted to pause on voices. Ruth Wilson's voice in this was amazing. It was deep and it was loud. It had that amount of bass to it that indicates presence. She had a fantastic, may very well have just been her own voice. Who knows what people actually sound like? It had authority. Part of it was that sense of entitlement that you get when you're brought up posh, but part of it was also the sense of just needing to get stuff done.
Yes,
And Donald Gleeson's voice, delightfully psychopathic. It was clipped and it was quite quiet sometimes. It kept reminding me of somebody else. Just gonna look up who it is.
I think on that it's important as well, in the novel there is a part where he discusses losing his regional accent and remembering sounding a bit more like Betty, but when he goes to medical school he very quickly gets rid of it.
It was Ben Whishaw, that's who that particular voice reminded me of. There's a few links actually between these actors, because Will Poulter and Domhnall Gleeson, they were in The Revenant together.
Oh, right.
So they have acted together before. I kept thinking, Ruth Wilson, where do I know her from? She was one of many Jane Eyres from the past 20 or so years. She was Jane Eyre in a 4-part TV thing that was in about 10 years ago. She was in Salem Mr. Banks. She was the voice of the main character's wife in Locke. Remember that thing with...
Oh no,
Tom
not
Hardy,
that one where he's
just
in
driving.
the car and he's trying to be Welsh. Oh, that
Yeah.
was awful. I hated that film.
2006, she was in a 4-part TV miniseries of Jane Eyre as Jane, and she was perfect for being Jane, because the whole thing about Jane is she's supposed to be not conventionally beautiful. She's supposed to be a bit self-effacing and the kind of person who just keeps going, everyone stop looking at me. And she did that amazingly. There was elements of that character in Caroline as well. She's been in a lot of stuff, including a 2007 short called Get Off My Land. Now appears to be Ruth Wilson's time. She's still doing a lot of TV. Dark River, we've been meaning to see that for a while, haven't we?
And what about, who did the screenplay?
Screenplay, Lucinda Coxon. The Heart of Me is her screenplay. She's mainly a playwright. Her screenplays include The Heart of Me, Lily and the Secret Planting, Spaghetti Slow, and The Danish Girl, which of course is an adaptation. She also did a bit of TV screenwriting. She adapted Michael Faber's novel The Crimson Petal and the White as a BBC miniseries back in 2011.
I'm just trying to figure it out, because I feel like when I saw Rim and Frank and what Richard did, I could see the hallmarks of Lenny Abrahamson as a director, and in this I'm not sure I could pick up on very much.
Actually, yeah. Apart from using quite shallow focus lenses, so quite short lenses, there was nothing else that was really Abrahamson.
No, I think certainly some subtleties in the visual design, areas where visually it's very economic, and by economic I mean it's telling a lot within one image. It's telling like several pages of dialogue, for example, but just in one image. You know, it does that quite a lot, very effectively in the film.
Well, I've often heard it said that what you do when you adapt a piece of prose fiction to a film is you pick up the novel, you shake it so that all the description falls out, then you surgically take out more than half the dialogue, and then you have to work out how you're going to create some sort of appropriate equivalent for all of that description filmically, and then you have to write a load of your own dialogue just to add to all of that as well. That's a kind of process, description of a process, which makes me think, why does anyone make an adaptation?
I am wondering, and then because before the screening started and we were in a very quiet classic, which is the biggest screen in the Tyneside.
Comfy seats.
I think that's the smallest amount of people I've ever had in there, and I've been to quite a few matinees at midday in that screening with lots more people than that there. When you were saying that it's not doing very well at the box office so far, and it's been out for... It started in the Tyneside on Friday this week, and it's Sunday, so it's the opening weekend here, but I think it may have been out for longer than that.
It opened, I think, late August.
But it's not picking up that much.
Which, you know, we could attribute to several things, such as unclear trailer.
It's hard to know what kind of film it is.
Yeah.
So we were talking about this a bit before the film as well. It's historical fiction, but there's also this paranormal element, and there might be parts of it that are a bit like horror, but you can't really call it a horror film because most of it isn't that.
Yeah.
Just moments of it are. There's just moments of tension, and there's slight moments of what you could call gore. It's a really difficult one to market.
Combine that with... You proposed that the bad weather recently might have been playing some havoc. There's been some storms.
We've had some bad storms.
But also add in, there isn't a really strong roster of names behind this.
I didn't even know Charlotte Rampling was in it until the film started.
Did you notice who else was in it and didn't even say anything?
Yes.
He was just in 2 shots.
I was trying to remember his name.
What's his
He was at
name?
the funeral.
He was just in the back of a shot for
I was
a couple of
wondering if
seconds.
maybe he was one of Caroline's uncles, because he was just there at 2 of the shots at Mrs. Irish's funeral.
Trying to find him on IMDb.
If he's just been there as say he had lines that were cut out and he's now basically a background actor.
Nicholas Farrell. Born Nicholas Frost. What's he been in? Oh, first film, Chariots of Fire. He was the mayor in Mindhorn. He's been in plenty of telly, of course. He was Brigadier Patrick McClellan in Bloody Sunday in 2002.
Right.
Okay, telly. It's got to be some recent telly that we can recognise him from. He was a Prime Minister at some point in Torchwood. Mr. Musgrove in the 2007 TV series version of Persuasion. And there was also another actor who was right next to him. I thought, oh, he's quite a posh, expensive
They were
actor.
around. They needed
Yeah.
it. It's good.
So, but I'm thinking, A, they had scenes that were cut, or B, they were visiting friends on set one day,
Possible.
and someone went,
Yeah.
it'd be so cool if you did a
Yeah.
cameo, and then the cameo was just being in the background of the funeral.
I've been wondering how much Abrahamson is a director for hire on this and how much control he's had. It does feel like Sunday night TV movie. It feels like very high quality, but I don't know, I just feel like probably if it was a 4-part serial
Yeah.
of an hour and a half each episodes of this quality, I'd be really impressed. But with the film, I really enjoyed watching it, but I can see why it's not grabbing people in to go and see it in the cinema.
A lot of the reasons why films don't do well financially are nothing to do with how good the film is.
Yeah.
But by the same token, the reasons why a lot of films do well financially is because of good word of mouth. And I don't think this film's going to get that.
No, because I just feel like people might say, don't waste your money on it, just rent it when you're at home, just watch it at home.
Wait for the DVD.
It's so difficult with adaptations, especially if the book is really loved. When I announced on social media that I'd read this book and I feel really late to the party, quite a lot of people I know said, oh, it's a fantastic book, it's so great you finally read it. So it's like, okay, well, I didn't know it existed till I got a free copy a couple of years ago.
Just to fill people in, if a book ends up as the Booker Prize Foundation's one book a year that they give away thousands of copies to Newcastle University students, Newcastle University staff tend to get free copies as well because they're just lying around. There's quite a few copies of the various books that have been the one book over the years. You were saying that Lenny he's been a hit.
I don't know if I would say hit though, because he makes quite niche films. Certainly the likes of his Irish films. Adam and Paul was his first film. I saw it quite a few years after it was first made in a special screening that was fairly packed. It's about homelessness and drug addiction. It's quite gritty, it's on the streets of Dublin, and it's quite a contemporary kind of realism. It's deeply tragic, but there are very funny moments in it as well. It feels very true to life and done with non-professional actors mostly. Then the likes of what Richard did when it's again an Irish film, but he's got more of a budget behind him and really strong cast, and you start to see what he's capable of. He's an incredible storyteller in the way that he tells things, and this is where I think there could have been a really nice comparison. There probably still could be actually, because when what Richard did is very similar in that Richard is a very privileged young man in quite a posh area of Dublin, and he gets away with quite a lot of stuff. But he doesn't even see what he's done wrong or that he could do wrong. He's this young man that everybody in the community looks up to. Again, he is that pillar of the community type guy that everybody doesn't believe could possibly be violent or take advantage of young girls or any of that. And he does all of those things. There's quite a few things that Richard does in the film, but the thing that the title's really getting at is that there's quite a violent exchange with one of his friends and he kicks the guy in the head, and then at some point during that night the guy dies, but there's no evidence, and of course Richard just gets on with his life, and this tragic thing has happened to everybody. There are these things that he doesn't talk about. He just breezes through life. He doesn't even need to deny anything because there's no suspicion on him, so he just gets on with his life. I think in a similar way to Faraday, in that there's something very toxic underneath that very calm, pleasant surface. So it feels like an examination of that kind of masculinity, where it's on the surface you're a really nice, decent guy, the sort of person people look up to. You and in both, you've got a class thing, because Richard is from a very middle class, fairly well off family. I think it came out in 2012. I think it might be set during the Celtic Tiger, so it's set a few years before, but it's a while ago since I've seen it. With Faraday, he's bettered himself, but he's still not good enough. And there are people reminding him of that throughout, like at the party that he goes to at the heirs home the first time. You know, people keep saying, oh, are they keeping you around because Roderick's not well? I'm a guest here, very indignantly, you know.
Yeah.
But then, of course, he has to prove his worth as a great doctor, because something sparks something in the dog, in Jip, that this is a very placid, friendly dog, a very caring dog. It's at a point in the story where you could think the girl who's, so that these very liberal parents have brought their child, and their child is a nightmare, and she's not especially badly behaved in the novel, I don't think. There is just a hint that she's trying to play with the dog and the dog's not interested. It's not that kind of dog, it's a working dog. It's not really interested in playing, and it's quite an old dog, so it just can't be bothered with her. They make her very precocious in the film, a lot more than she is in the book. She's constantly running after the dog, she's drinking people's wine, she's talking out of place, whereas in the book you're just getting the descriptions of his annoyance at her and her bothering the dog, and then suddenly behind the curtain this horrible noise happens. I was wondering how they were going to do that orally, and it is pretty sickening in the sound design. The sounds of, because you don't see anything happen, you don't see any violence, but you just hear this awful sound of screaming and tearing flesh. So something has bugged this dog into doing something it wouldn't have done.
A reading of the whole film, probably of the book indirectly, just occurred to me, and it's since about the middle of the 1990s, the general tenor of thought about kids is that it's not possible for a kid to be culpable for any act of violence. That they're even more innocent than they were imagined during the Victorian period. We've managed to get kids to the point of automatic and utter innocence on all matters. This isn't to say that's wrong, kids are culpable for all the things that they do. It's just that it's much less simplistic than that, isn't it? This seems to be a novel which is about a kid who has the ability to kill people. Not through doing anything physically, he can just detach part of himself and that part can go off and kill people, because it's made pretty clear in the movie that's what happened to Suki shortly afterwards, and it seems that happened because young Faraday split himself off and the magic part went and did something to him.
I think she gets ill in the novel, and it's quite a prolonged illness.
And that seems to be part. Mrs. Ayres did say something like about her getting ill late that night in the film too. This is a version of a kid in which the kid has the ability to wreak horrible acts on the people around him.
The violence as well is against women and girls. With Roderick and the dog, it's relatively gentle. Roderick survives. He's in the asylum, he's safe. But the girls, so Suki, Susan, has died long ago, and the little girl survives the dog attack but is disfigured for the rest of her life by it. There's a lot more with her in the book as well. He goes to visit her, and then another doctor supersedes him because he's not high enough a class to deal with it anymore, even though he's done a really good job at sewing up her face. But she's disfigured. Her life is effectively ruined because her face becomes disfigured by this attack. The dog has to lose its life, but it's put to sleep by Faraday very gently. It's the women who have violent deaths. So Suki's had this prolonged illness. It's been very difficult. Mrs. Ayres has these cuts happening on her body spontaneously, and then she wakes up and finds in the film the photograph of Suki shattered, the glass shattered,
Right, yeah.
and that's what she's slit her wrists with. you think she's slit her own wrists. There's actually a lot more in the book because there are inquests at these as well, where there is an inquest for Mrs. Ayres as well because she's been found, like Caroline, it's found to be suicide even though it's possible that there's evidence that she didn't do it herself.
Yeah.
Something else did it.
And I suppose what this does then is it traces what Faraday's doing to the women around him back to that one moment where his mum hit him for snapping the acorn off the plaster frame to a mirror in the house and doing it in front of Suki back in 1919.
That's really interesting because that just isn't in the book. He takes it home, he hides it, and she finds it, confronts him and throws it in the fire. He never encounters the girl directly, he just watches from afar. So it's a bit more creepy actually in the book. But of course the film has to get there very quickly, and it has to, I mean, in a way, I think something that's niggling at me with the film is that I think it's treating the audience as if they're not that clever and they can't work this stuff out for themselves, and that's why I'm thinking I don't know how much control Lenny Abrahamson's had, because it's just not him to do that.
Well, next time you meet him down the pub, do ask. The reason I mentioned the idea of Lenny being a hit is what I meant was so far he hits the mark every time director, and maybe this is just going to be his first he didn't quite hit the mark film.
Yeah, but he's also a jobbing director. He's got a family to provide for. He hasn't made anything since Rim.
The suitable comparison may be Guy Ritchie for Mark Kermode, because Mark Kermode, when the new Guy Ritchie film comes along, he goes open mind and sometimes he loves it, and then another Guy Ritchie film a couple of years later, open mind, it's complete pants. It's quite possible that Lenny will do 3 that are great, and then he'll do 2 that are not, and then he'll do another 2 that are great. But this is probably damning him with faint praise at the moment. He's not got the Guy Ritchie record yet.
But the thing is, it's not a bad film.
No, not at all.
Not by any means at all. It's just not to the standard of Room or what Richard did or Frank, that's all. But it's still a good film. But then again, that question of, I really loved the novel, so am I a bit prejudiced against the film anyway, because it can never be the novel. That's that problem that comes with adaptation.
Beast, you.
There's probably more to get into, but it's extremely late and I'm up early in the morning.
It's midnight, okay? Right.
So,
ciao.
But thank you for coming and seeing it with me.
Thanks for coming to the movies.
To be part of the conversation, we are at AV Cultures on Twitter and Facebook. We always welcome suggestions for topics and guest contributors to sustain, improve and expand the podcast and website, where you can find links to all episodes and more information. Please support us via patreon.com. I'm also very grateful for one-off donations to paypal.me/PEA Blair. Thanks so much for listening, following, sharing and supporting. Take care and catch you next time.